Okay, welcome back. So in this video, we're continuing with t-tests. We'll be talking about two different kinds. The first is this two independent samples, and then the second is related samples. And so refreshing our memory about where we're at in this course, these are all the different tests for differences between groups. Previously, we were focused on one group with our z and independent sample t. Now we're going to move on to testing differences between two different groups. Right, so if we look here, we have a decision point in how participants are observed between subjects or within subjects, relating to whether it's two independent sample or related samples. And so to kind of begin this discussion, we might ask this question, what do we mean by independent samples and related samples? And we'll get to that, but I think it'd be easier if we start with a different question, that being what you see here. What do we mean by between subjects and within subjects? Because these are terms that you'll hear a lot in this class and then throughout your learning in social sciences, like if you're a psych major, for example. And so when we talk about between and within subjects, or how we observe participants, what we're really referring to here is our study design and research questions. Or ultimately, we're referring to our study design, but that is informed by our research questions. And so to elaborate on that, starting with a within subjects design, and this we're measuring, so I guess in any of these, right, we're measuring some dependent variable, right? Some variable of interest, and we want to see if there are changes or differences. And in within subjects, we're looking at that variable within the same people, right? So if it makes it easier, you can replace the word subjects with people. So in this case, it's a within people design or within persons design. And so, in other words, we're looking at the same people over multiple different points in time. And so, one example there, let's say that I'm working as an IO psychologist and I develop some new training program for first responders, right? Like EMTs, firefighters, police, right? All these different people that are first responders. And let's say we've been having a lot of issues in our community with mental health crises and how people respond to those. And so we want to teach people how to communicate better with people who are experiencing a mental health crisis, right? So I developed this training program and want to test it to see if it's actually working and doing some good. And so if I wanted to do this, then I could say have these just represent individuals, right? Obviously, it'd probably be bigger than this. The sample would be, but for the sake of example, let's say we have these people. And so before we give them any training, we have some sort of way to evaluate their experiences or abilities in this regard, right? So we put some tests together and we have these pre-training scores for each person, right? The nature of that test isn't totally important for the example. So if that's not clicking with you, let's just, for the sake of example, let's say we could measure this somehow. And we have a pre-training score, and then we want to compare it to their post-training score, right? So in other words, before and after they receive this training, we just want to see, okay, did we actually make an impact? Did we make a difference, right? And then you could do that with the other people as well, right? And so in this example then, come on mouse, there we go. In this example, we're still assessing a sample, right? We're not just assessing one person, but we're looking for changes or differences within those individual participants that make up our sample. Or in other words, all participants receive all treatments, right? They're all going through the same experience in our study. Ultimately, we're just looking for changes across these different points in time. Or in this example, it's points in time, right? It could vary. And so we can contrast that with a between subjects design in which different participants are observed at each level of the factor. That's a word I haven't defined yet, I think. So broadly speaking, we can think factor is a variable, right? So different participants are observed at each level of the variable. Or in other words, we select independent samples for these different um, conditions, right, essentially. Yeah, and I guess the way this is worded is confusing. Different participants are observed at each level of the factor. A better way to say that is different participants are observed at different levels of the factor, right? So it's not each participant going through each level, rather they are separate and independent from one another. And so an example using education as an example here. So let's say I'm working at UAF and I develop some new type of peer advising program, right? I want it to help first year students feel like they belong, like they have some community, like they can succeed, like they're capable. And so I developed this program where I pair first year students with third year students, right? That way that they know someone who's a little bit more experienced at UAF or at whatever university I'm at. And so they can feel connected. They can have someone to ask for advice, even if it's simple stuff like where do I go buy my books, right? Little things like that that might extrapolate to something bigger where they can get this sense of belonging. And so I want to assess this and see if it works. Well, a simple way I could do that is if we have this hypothetical population of first year students, I could randomly assign some people to be students in this peer advising program, right? This new program. And then other students who are randomly assigned to have the usual experience, right? So it's not like they're not receiving anything that they otherwise should be because we're still testing it. Rather, they're just going on as we've done it before, right? And then we can somehow compare scores and peer era and belonging and success and things like that to see if it's making a difference, right? And so in this example, now compared to the previous one, we're looking for changes or differences between these groups, right? So participants receive different treatments depending on how they're grouped in this example, if they're in the peer advising program or not. So hopefully that helps to explain this little question down here. Let's go up to the top. What do we mean by independent samples and related samples? And so, yeah, I won't spend too much time on this. So as mentioned previously, in independent samples, they're unrelated, right? They're separate, independent. And so participants are observed only once in only one sample. And so in order to be considered independent, they could be, well, there's a few different things we could have here. For one, they could be selected from two or more populations. So say, for example, I was doing a study and I wanted to look at differences or comparisons between, I guess we're still in the population of UA students, but sort of these subpopulations of UAF and UAA, right? So maybe I select a sample from UAF and a sample from UAA, right? Those are two different examples, or two different samples from different populations. Or I could select participants from a single population and then randomly assign them to groups. So say, for example, I didn't have any students from UAA, only UAF, and then I randomly assigned some UAF students to sample 1 and others to sample 2. That would still be considered an independent sample, right? And so then in related samples, intuitively, the participants or each group is related. Not like family related, right? Rather just related in a generic, broad sense, right? There is some sort of shared relationship there. So, for example, that could be observed in more than one group, what we'd call repeated measures design, which we'll elaborate on further. So, say in this example, again, only UAF students, but some I'm looking at time 1, and then I follow those students and then look at them again at time 2. Maybe, for example, I want to understand people's experiences between their first year and graduation, right? So I give them some survey in their first year and then another graduation. Or they could be matched based on characteristics or traits. So say, for example, I selected students from UAF and UAA, different samples, and then I matched them somehow. Maybe it was like, maybe, for example, I wanted to do the same thing, looking at student experiences across like the college experience, and I matched them based off their major and high school GPA or something like that, right? Then I just wanted to see how their experiences compared, or maybe if they were psych majors who are first gen or from rural Alaska, or I don't know, whatever it may be, right? Some way to match people. So it could be some sort of experimental matching, like if we manipulate traits or measure GPA or something like that. Or it could be natural matching. So, like I mentioned, first gen status could be race or ethnicity, right? Could be a variety of different things. I will say this is one that I'd say, for me personally at least, I've encountered much, much less than other types of designs just because I think logistically this kind of research gets really challenging. Because yeah, or we don't need to get into all the research design stuff for this class, but for what it's worth, just know that this is one that I've encountered a lot less, and I think it's fair to assume that you might encounter less too. So this is all of it summarized in one little chart here: repeated measures, match pairs. To elaborate a little bit further on these bottom categories here. So within a repeated measures design, one type is called a pre-post design. And so this is like the example earlier with the training for first responders. So here we have something before, some intervention or treatment, and then some measurement after that. So a pre and a post. So for example, time one, then there's some treatment, and then we have another measurement at time two. But again, this is still within the same sample. So some examples for you, kind of related to the similar one. Say I wanted to measure safety knowledge before and after some training program about safety, just to again like see if I was actually making a difference, if people were learning from the training. Maybe I'm giving a workshop about diversity, and I want to measure attitudes towards diversity before and after that, right? See if we're opening minds a little bit, or maybe we're having some unintended opposite effect. Or a more basic example, say I'm doing some upgrades to my home. I have some cabin and I put more insulation on the walls or did something like that. And I want to measure fuel consumption before and after those upgrades, right? Basically just see, okay, did this actually make a difference? Am I saving money on fuel? Is this more environmentally friendly? So on and so forth. Another type of repeated measures design is within subjects. And so in this, basically the same thing, it's just without the stipulation that timing matters. So in other words, we have two measurements, but they're not necessarily in any particular order. We're more interested in the difference regardless of which one comes first. So for example, if we're looking at the effects of exercise on overall well-being, and then we have people do aerobic exercise and anaerobic exercise. So like cardio versus maybe weightlifting, for example. And we want to see if that affects their well-being differently, right? It theoretically doesn't really matter which one of these we assess at one time versus another time. Say I'm on, I don't know, some like cross-country team or something. Maybe that's a bad example. I'll use football as an example because that's what I played. So we wanted to compare our team's performance at our home field, our home stadium, and then at away fields or away stadiums to assess if we had some sort of home field advantage. All right, that's just a broad comparison. Or building on the previous example about fuel consumption, maybe I wanted to compare my total fuel consumption with or without a wood stove. Right. So in other words, is using a wood stove actually um, helping out, or is it beneficial in a way beyond just comfort? Maybe is this actually affecting overall fuel consumption? And I wanted to assess that. Right. So just some examples of how we might do this. And then for match pairs, again, this one I've encountered a lot less, so I don't really spend too much time on it. I already mentioned the example experimental versus natural. Um, but one example, if this helps, if you've ever watched like a football game on TV, um, or even like maybe this picture will tell you enough. So in match pairs designs, let me back up. We have different yet matched participants who are observed at each treatment, and we're basically comparing scores, right? So people in different groups, but we've matched them somehow, and so we're comparing them directly. And so an example of this made me think of is like I used to love watching football, and sometimes there'd be these comparisons like between quarterbacks, right? And so they'd show these people who are in the same position, so they're matched on that trait. And then we're seeing how their performance compared in any given day or in any given game. Or another example might be like the Iditarod. This is results from this year, 2023. Right? Ultimately, these are different participants, and they're all matched, and they're all going through the same course, and we're comparing their performance on the race. Right? So not as good of an example, but hopefully something that might help if this isn't clicking for you. Okay, so that was a lot about methods, and actually, you know what? I'll go ahead and stop it there just to break it up, and then we'll pick this up in the next video.